Okay, so now we're all settled and behaving ourselves. So what we're going to be doing today is looking at aspects of the Synoptic Gospels, and indeed all four of the New Testament Gospels, that highlight the differences between them. Okay, so for the last couple of weeks we've been focusing more on the commonalities. And the reason we talk about the Synoptic Gospels is that three of the four Gospels are so close, as I've said, if they were handed in by students as essays, they'd be referred to the academic misconduct officer, because clearly there's been some use of other people's material without proper acknowledgement by our canons going into those three. So we've got three that have a lot in common, and we have a fourth Gospel, Gospel of John, which is quite different. And so most of the stuff we've been doing so far has been looking at the sort of commonalities of the three and how the three synoptics are collectively different from John. Okay? But today we're going to be looking at the distinctive dimensions of each of the Gospels. So that'll provide a bit of a balance to the sort of the focus the last couple of weeks, and the basic text in it, apart from the Bible, the basic kind of stimulus text for this week is the 40-page or so chapter by Tim Harris. Now, Tim is one of the other lecturers in this subject. Okay, he's actually the assistant bishop in the Diocese of Adelaide. He was previously the principal of a Bible college in New Zealand, and before that he was the rector of a parish in Adelaide, so you can sort of get a sense of where he's been in the last couple of years. So Tim teaches Synoptic Gospels in Adelaide at St Barnabas College, along with David Neville teaching in Adelaide, and a guy called Jeff Arney who's teaching at UTC, and myself. So you've got four of us teaching the Synoptic Gospel class, which in itself is a little bit like a synoptic problem, as my wife so kindly and generously pointed out on the way to work this morning. Oh, that's just like the Synoptic Gospels. I said, oh, so you mean like my lecture is like a gospel? No, that wasn't what I said. I said, I thought that's what you meant. Okay, so in a sense you've got four people, okay, Jeff in Sydney, Tim in Adelaide, David in Canberra and doing the distance ed class, myself here, and we're all teaching to the same curriculum. We're all going to be marking assignments by students, addressing the same set of tasks. We're all using the same basic input material in terms of the set readings and so on, but of course we're getting four different takes on what biblical scholarship is, what the Gospels are, how to approach them, and so on. So there is a sense in which what we're going to be doing today is partly driven by the article that Tim wrote, and the reason it's in the set reading is that it really pulls together very well in a very detailed way, as I suspect you discovered if you've put the other assignments aside long enough. Okay, don't look sheepish, but if you have actually put the other assignments aside long enough to read Tim's article, it's quite detailed, and he's teasing out some of the ways in which each of the Gospels are distinct from one another. And so, that's part of a larger volume which looks at a number of different aspects of gospel studies. So that as I was reading it, and what I'm doing in this lecture is to basically follow Tim's structure of pulling out 4 or 5 themes, or categories, like beginnings and endings, and settings, characters, encounters, and content and themes, and so on. Taking each of those sort of categories and working through and looking at each of the Gospels. I'm doing it a little bit differently, partly because it's me and a different person doing the same stuff, but I think it's easy for us to pick up the differences if instead of doing as Tim does, you go through Mark, look at the 5 different categories, then Matthew, the 5 different categories, then Luke, and then John. I'm actually taking them category by category and then looking at what the mark and data is like under that category, going straight to Matthew, straight to John, straight to Luke. Therein lies one of the differences. I toyed with not following my own preference, which is to put Luke last. Okay, I thought, well, we've already put Mark first, so we're already presuming Mark and priority, which I think is a blazingly obvious lay down misere kind of dynamic. So why not go the other way as well? And so I'm choosing to arrange the data so that we'll look at Luke as the last of the four Gospels. Now, I may be wrong about that, and we may be wrong about Mark being the first of the Gospels, but we're not actually following the canonical order if we go Mark, Matthew, Luke, John. And so I'm taking the freedom to vary from the canonical order even more and go Mark, Matthew, John, Luke as a way of teasing out the dissimilarities or the distinctive dimensions of the Gospels. So I hope you'll find that this way of pulling it together works okay in terms of sort of taking the sort of issues that Tim was discussing in his article, but reassembling them topic by topic rather than gospel by gospel. And along the way, I'll also add in some other perspectives and some other differences, some other bits of material we want to consider. So we're taking, as in this case, one of the research questions is what counts as data. So it's not the stuff that we think actually happened. It's simply the canonical form of the Gospels. Okay? And we're playing with the data just to the extent that we're not doing them in canonical sequence. Okay? Which to some extent, we encounter the Gospels in canonical sequence. In another sense, we don't, because our primary way of encountering the Gospels will be what we're getting in church on a particular Sunday, and that'll be the Gospel of the year. So, this year it's Matthew, next year it's Mark, and so on. Okay. So the first big critical question is what counts as data? Well, in this case, it's limited to the canonical Gospels, but it is all of the canonical Gospels as they stand, warts and all. Okay? Is that right? You're frowning at me, which could be many reasons why you're frowning at me, but sometimes it means someone's not quite getting what I'm saying. You right? Okay. Okay, the second then thing is the issue of how we go, or when or should we go beyond the data. And one of the things that I think I noticed as I was reading through that article a couple of times, and I noticed in other literature as well, is that there's a tendency to go beyond the data, beyond what's actually in the New Testament, and to present what's in the New Testament in a way that reflects our pious enthusiasm for Jesus. Okay? So as some of us heard yesterday, a person was speaking and talked about he's rather attached to Jesus or attracted to Jesus and so on. But one of the points that came out towards the end of that reflection was that there was a reference to Jesus being sinless or without sin. Really? Do we really think Jesus was without sin? Now, there's one verse in Hebrews that talks about he was without sin, okay? But that's talking about sin in the concept of ritual temple purity, not saying he never once had a naughty thought, he never once lost his temper, he never once was tempted to lust, or whatever. So we have this tendency as Christians to put Jesus up on a pedestal, and wrap him up in a bag, in I guess some sort of bubble where nothing imperfect ever goes inside that bubble. Okay? And it's understandable that we do that as part of our sort of devotion to this character. But historically, it doesn't stand up. Okay? And if his mum was here, I'm sure she could tell us some stories about what a naughty boy he was, and he didn't clean that corner of the cave house in Nazareth that some of us have been in. The dust was always heavier, and he didn't just go, and all the things went back on their shelf like Mary Poppins or whatever, okay? So Jesus has to be a real human being to be of any earthly use, okay? Now, the way that comes out sometimes is that people, when discussing the Gospels, I think will be so enthusiastic about Jesus, they express things in ways that are not really defensible, that go way beyond the evidence. But it meshes really well, because that's how we talk about him in church. But the way we talk about Jesus in church, in our liturgies and prayers, is not necessarily the way we should be talking about Jesus in the lecture room or when doing our more academic study, or indeed in everyday life. Okay? The Jesus we talk about in church probably does find car parks at shopping centres for little old ladies. But the real life Jesus doesn't, I suggest. Okay? And for tired and hassled lecturers, okay, who are in a hurry, looking for a microphone late on Wednesday afternoon or something. Okay, so, and I also note then, in reflecting on my own practice, I possibly overcompensate at that point. Okay? And I probably understate. I'm probably deliberately understated in the language I use for Jesus. And that probably comes across in some circles as, does this guy even believe in Jesus? Okay? Because I'm not pushing the right sound buttons for some of the sound effects that certain types of Christian spirituality think I should be pressing. And the shorter answer is, I'll be my kind of Jesus person, you be your kind of Jesus person, get off my case. But, we'll come to that in Synod, I guess. Okay. Then there's the question of how we reframe the data, and I see this a lot. I see it a lot in essays, actually, but I see it a lot in essays, I suspect, because we all see it a lot in textbooks. And sometimes too much of the textbook phrasing survives into the essay phrasing. Okay? So word to the wise there as well. And it comes out in expressions like, the Gospels record that Jesus did such and such. Do they really? Or do the Gospels present Jesus as saying such and such? There is a world of difference in those two statements. One is giving the benefit of the doubt that the Gospels record it, Jesus said it. And the other is saying, well, just because the Gospels say it doesn't mean that Jesus said it. It simply means that Mark chose to say it that way and present Jesus that way. That becomes particularly significant when we're looking at places where the Gospels differ from one another. Because then, unless Jesus was constantly confronted by rich young men running up, dropping on their knees and asking what they had to do to be saved, then we've got three different answers to the rich young ruler, in the three different Gospels. So it's not simply a case that the Gospels are recording what Jesus said, or even sort of reporting what Jesus said. The Gospels are not, if in one sense the Gospels are reports, but they're not eyewitness transcripts. They are accounts. Okay? And even if it was a photograph, the angle, the exposure, the colour, the background, all of those things make for a different kind of photo of the very same object. So it's how the story or how the representation is composed is as much as part of the meaning as the content. So there are some methodological issues there for me. One is that, yes, we're focusing on the data. Secondly, we'll try to just take the data as it is and not to layer it with a coating of Christian honey. Just take the data as it is. And the third thing is to be alert to points where we hear ourselves saying, but the Gospels report Jesus as, rather than in the Gospels we find Jesus described this way, or presented in this way, or portrayed in this way. The fact we have is that Mark chose to describe Jesus that way. Whether or not Jesus was that way is up for grabs, and we may never be able to answer it. Okay, so being and we hear this a lot in sermons, in reflections, and also in theological textbooks. Okay, and it's moving beyond that simple, naive embrace of the words of Scripture as simply that's how it was, while hopefully avoiding the problem of, whoops, honey, I just threw the baby out with the bathwater. Okay? Because we don't want to go there either. But so there's a level of being nuanced in our use of Scripture which gets beyond deconstruction, and where we still use the Scripture for spiritual wisdom, but we do also benefit from having turned on our brains and acquired a theological education. Because what often happens is that after you've managed to survive 4 years or so here and take on board as little as possible of what the lecturers are saying, okay, you then go out to your parish and speak and act as if you've never done any theological studies.
called going native.
Yeah, going native. It's what it happens in all professions. It happens with teachers and nurses and other people as well. Okay, so just be alert to that as well.
Does it make your heart ache, Greg?
Let's just say when you're not actually in a parish of your own, it is very hard to find a parish one can bear to sit on the pews in on a Sunday morning. Okay, give me the steering wheel. I need to be in charge here. This is awful. And it's a whole mix of things from needing to be in charge, wanting to be in charge, and, oh my God, he's saying what? Okay.
It's an interesting thing. I wonder if there's ways that we need to find new language, because you have to be aware of, I'm conscious of this because I was preaching on Sunday, and aware of people's position, and you're not there to wrench their faith that they have of them in a way that's vigorous or, constructive. And I think I was aiming, no, probably a bit too, I was aiming at presenting this is the story, and you can preach from the story.
Yep.
I think without actually offending people and be true to the story, and present it like that. What people hear, of course, and that conversation after, what people hear is that, well, I'm so glad you're not like one of these progressive people who actually went,
Obviously didn't go far enough today. However, no, that's the challenge, and absolutely, our role in a liturgical and pastoral situation is not the role that I'm sitting in at the moment in a lecture room at a theological college. It's equally true that what I do in the pulpit or at the altar should reflect my understanding of the tradition, while being true and valid and faithful and attentive to the context. And my experience is that can happen. It doesn't mean that if someone comes in with a really hard set negative agenda, you're going to make them leave happy. There's one famous, when I first went to Forest Lake, I used to always just give the sermon, but just standing sort of in the front row, and we'd stop and have a conversation. And then one Sunday, a new person, who was an ex-JW, I later discovered, turned up, and he asked, it was in after Easter, so it was in the yet another Sunday of John kind of stuff. And he asked the question, so how much of the words in John's Gospel do you think Jesus actually said? And I said, well, probably none. And just went on. And well, there was a 45-minute toe-to-toe after the service. But so that's also the risk of the unguarded response, as distinct from a considered presentation. But this person actually came with an agenda and was only going to accept one kind of answer, and it wouldn't have mattered how gently I broke that to him. Even the article by Tim Harris says at one point, let's say this starkly, in John's Gospel we're hearing John's construction of the Jesus we're going to hear about. Now that's to me not quite stark enough. What he actually is trying not to say is there's nothing in John that actually comes from Jesus. Okay? It's coming from the imagination, from the faith, from the experience of the gospel writer who's verbaling Jesus with this massive discourse. But he's also playing to his audience, so he has to be more guarded in the way he says that, and we all do that. Having said that, one of the really lovely feedback, I often get feedback years later, and just in the last couple of weeks, there's a person living in the same retirement village as my mother, who used to be a parishioner of mine at Forest Lake before they moved to Aveo. And my mother and this lady ended up at knitting club, sitting next to each other, and this lady discovered that my mother is the mother of Greg Jenks. Okay. No, there are women at Aveo with that attitude, okay. But to my mother's relief, there are other ladies at Aveo who know me from Forest Lake and Centenary suburbs who think I'm wonderful. And this woman just said, he's the only priest I've ever known who made sense. Now that's an amazing mistake on her part. No, that's a delightful and amazingly bit of feedback. Many years after she last saw me or heard me doing anything, that in her long experience, she's now in her late 80s, early 90s. One priest stands out. Okay, now, I dropped round to her house 2 afternoons ago to drop in a copy of the new book. So, okay. which my mum had actually bought, and I said, "Is this for so and so?" And she said, "Yes, it is actually." I said, "Would you like me to drop it around to her?" Well, anyway, turns out she'd just been taken back to hospital because of serious pain management issues, but her husband and daughter were there, and her daughter said, "What's your name again?" I said, "Oh, Greg." "Oh, yes, she only talks about one Greg." Okay, now, she hasn't been in my congregation for 10 years, okay? But for whatever reason, I stood out as somebody who, in her experience of church, this was somebody who made sense. Okay. I've got a fan club, yeah, at a Aveo retirement village. But yeah, no, I have been there to do seminars and workshops as well. Old people are really interested in exploring questions because they're about to die and they've got nothing to lose. They're not trying to get ordained, they're not trying to get appointed to a parish, they're not trying to get onto parish council. They've got nothing to lose. They want truth. And they want to ask the questions, they don't want any of that other stuff. Okay, now they also may want reassurance and want to be told it's all okay, honey, you're going to the right place. But some of them are very open to ask really challenging questions.
But I was looking on iView this morning at SBS Insight, the last one, which was on brainwashing, and very interesting. A girl who escaped from North Korea, a bloke who'd been a neo-Nazi and involved in violence and so on. But listening to it, what struck me was how many similarities there are, though there's violent, in the church. There's an awful lot of groupthink and social conditioning that stops people thinking clearly about issues. So have a look.
Yeah, okay, interesting. And again, one other person, my first parish of my own was Deception Bay many, many years ago now. And I was also their first, well, not their first priest, but they'd just been made a new parish, separate parish, and I was their first incumbent on their own. And the woman who played the organ, ran the ladies' guild, picked up all the old people and brought them to church. She was already in her 80s, but in her old Morris, Oxford. And she was the matriarch of that place in many ways. Particularly when we started services at Burpengary, she came with me to play the piano in the schoolroom at Burpengary while we started a new service, okay? So finally at the time I'm leaving, about to go to Fortitude Valley, and a similar sort of conversation. As we're driving to Burpengary one morning, she says, "I want to thank you for everything I've learned in the last 3 years. I've learned more in 3 years of you being here than in the previous 60 years of being in the church." Okay, so you go, wow. That's not the only thing it's about, but it's one of the things that ministry is about. So, yeah, finding ways to be authentic to your own understanding of Scripture and life and faith, presenting in ways which are inviting and inclusive. And we don't have to, even with things like inclusive language for God or for others and so on, we don't have to go to the extent of being in your face inclusive, although I love just to throw in the occasional female pronoun for God. That just rattles the folk in the pews nicely, just destabilises them a little bit. But we can select other language which is totally inclusive, and nobody feels they're being forced to use inclusive language. We're just choosing not to use exclusive, stereotypical language. So there's another way besides storming the front door and burning the place down. We can infiltrate and subvert and transform within rather than have conflict. So anyway, while my preference is objectivity, and I guess everybody is subjective. The question is to what extent we're conscious that the way I'm doing it is not the only way it can be done. And that's one of the ways of managing subjectivity. As a methodological, hermeneutical, and even apologetic strategy, I prefer to have less God talk in my theology. Because in my understanding, words like God, belief, and faith are yesterday's toast. And they don't really cut it with the kids at St Aidan's or the people at Forest Lake or whatever. They're words that you start using those words and the eyes come down. And it's not just my teenage daughters, okay? who have other reasons for not listening. So to me, objectivity is an intentional strategy, even if I can't always get there. And so I adopt a sort of minimalist hermeneutic quite intentionally. I would rather understate and underclaim the historical dimensions, for instance, in the Bible, than to overclaim and then be constantly retreating. Oh yes, okay, well you're right about that, okay, we can't say that anymore, but I still think we can say this. I'd rather say, okay, let's be pretty hard-nosed in our methodological skepticism, and then let's build a positive expression of the Jesus tradition from that base, rather than to be constantly trying to defend the indefensible and spend so much energy fighting off the barbarians at the gate that we don't actually get on with the life of the city. Okay, so that's my kind of strategic approach in terms of theology and hermeneutics and so on. And this sort of goes back, that wasn't a whole sidetrack before, Sue, thank you for that, because this stuff does preach. Sometimes, if you're going to take that approach, you can't preach that, there's no gospel in that. That's nonsense, and that's a very polite response. That's nonsense. Okay, this stuff does preach because it motivates people to live lives of compassion inspired by Jesus. That preaches. And that cuts through to the average Aussie in a way that all the God talk and stuff doesn't. Okay. So the other little tiny example that applies there is when I was working at Griffith Uni at one stage, in my period of exile from here. At one stage I was academic administrator for the Mount Gravatt campus, the Faculty of Education. And like any workplace, particularly in a sort of a public sector NGO kind of organisation, there was staff conflict, whether it's a TAFE college or a bowls club or anything else. One of the really nice bits of feedback was from one of my colleagues who said to me at one stage, you're a bit like the UN, and basically it was conflict between academic admin and student admin, because people in student admin never really understand what the university is for. Those of us who run academic admin, we do the courses, we deal with the theory with no students, and we have a much better sense of what... Okay, Karen is smiling, she knows the culture. So I was in charge of academic admin, but the great rival were the people around in the other wing from student admin, okay? And there was this never-ending civil war between student admin and academic admin. And one of my staff came in at one stage and said, you're actually not like us. You're a bit like the UN. You're not really partisan about academic admin, and you have friends in student admin of all places, sort of thing. Okay, and my response to it was, I guess that's partly because the deepest meaning and satisfaction of my life does not come out of how many heads I kick at work. Okay, my values and my satisfaction come from other stuff to do with my faith, and this is where I earn my bread and butter. But this is not where I work out who I am and what my worth is and so on. Now, was that a moment of personal testimony? I don't know, I don't do that stuff. But people I work with were noticing there's something different about this guy. Okay, and they knew I had been a priest, but they figured there's something different about this guy. So yeah, it does cut through in the marketplace.